Mohenjo-daro was built without kings, without temples to named gods, and without armies, and it worked. For at least 5 centuries, perhaps longer, a city of 40,000 or more people organized itself, fed itself, drained its own waste, and rebuilt itself after floods, not once but repeatedly, rising higher on its own ruins each time, without any of the instruments of power that every other ancient civilization considered essential. How is that possible? And if you find this story as extraordinary as it deserves to be, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. It genuinely helps us keep making serious, deeply researched history documentaries and helps more people around the world discover this work. What follows is not simply the story of a ruined city in the Indus Valley. It is the story of a civilization that chose, or perhaps evolved, a different answer to the oldest question in urban life. How do you get thousands of strangers to cooperate? You're about to follow a journey from the earliest farming villages on the edges of a great river plain, through the slow accumulation of knowledge, craft, and trade that made a true city possible, into the astonishing peak of Mohenjo-daro itself, where the streets ran straight, the drains ran underground, and the weights measured the same in every market from the Arabian Sea to the foothills of the Himalayas. You will watch the city strain under pressures it could not name, see the signs of a civilization beginning to unravel, and then witness the long silence that swallowed it whole. And at the end, you will understand why the rediscovery of Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s did not just add a footnote to ancient history. It forced scholars to rewrite the entire story of how civilization begins. To understand Mohenjo-daro, you first need to understand the world it was born into. The Indian subcontinent in the 4th and 3rd millennia before Common Era was not the uniform landscape it might appear on a modern map. The Northwest, the region today divided between Pakistan and northwestern India, was dominated by the Indus River system, one of the longest and most powerful river networks on Earth. The Indus itself, along with its tributaries including the Ravi, the Chenab, the Jhelum, the Beas, and the now largely dry Ghaggar-Hakra River, created a vast alluvial plain of extraordinary agricultural potential. This plain was wide, flat, and regularly renewed by seasonal floods that deposited fresh silt across the fields. For a farming society, it was close to paradise. For a city builder, it was both an opportunity and a constant threat. Mohenjo-daro sits in the Sindh province of modern Pakistan, on the right bank of the Indus, roughly 400 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Karachi. In its time, it was one of the 2 largest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, the other being Harappa, located several hundred kilometers to the northeast in what is now Punjab. Together, these 2 cities served as the twin anchors of a civilization that, at its height, covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. That comparison is worth sitting with. The Indus Valley civilization was not a footnote to the ancient world. It was, by geographic extent, the largest urban civilization of its era, but the city did not appear from nowhere. Its roots go back centuries before the great urban phase, into a long and productive prehistory of farming and craft-making that scholars call the early Harappan period, running roughly from around 3,500 to 2,600 before Common Era, and before that into what is called the pre-Harappan or early food-producing era, stretching back towards 7,000 before Common Era or even earlier. The site of Mehrgarh, located in the Balochistan region to the west of the Indus Plain, provides the clearest window into these deep origins. At Mehrgarh, excavation teams found evidence of settled farming communities growing wheat and barley, herding cattle, goats, and sheep, making pottery, and eventually working copper, all centuries before Mohenjo-daro was built. Mehrgarh was not Mohenjo-daro, but it was the kind of place that made Mohenjo-daro possible. Over those long centuries, the communities of the Indus region were not static. They were experimenting. They were learning which crops grew best in which soils, how to manage the unpredictable floods of the Indus, how to fire pottery at temperatures that produced stronger and more uniform vessels, how to smelt copper and bronze, how to build in fired brick rather than mud brick, and how to organize labor on a scale larger than a single family or a single village. By around 2,600 before Common Era, something had shifted. The scattered villages and small towns of the early Harappan period gave way, with remarkable speed in historical terms, to a network of large, planned cities. Mohenjo-daro was among the first and the greatest of them. The physical layout of Mohenjo-daro tells you almost everything you need to know about the civilization that built it and raises almost every question that still haunts researchers today. The city was organized into 2 main zones. To the west stood a raised mound, elevated on a massive mud brick platform, which scholars have conventionally called the citadel. To the east lay a much larger area called the lower city, where the majority of the population lived and worked. This basic division, a raised western mound and a lower eastern residential area, is found at Harappa and at other major Indus cities, suggesting it was a deliberate and widely shared urban design, not an accident of local geography. The citadel at Mohenjo-daro was not a palace. This is one of the most important and most overlooked facts about the site. Excavation teams found no building that can be confidently identified as a royal residence. They found no throne room, no grand audience hall, no treasury guarded by military architecture, no tomb of a king surrounded by sacrificed retainers. What they did find was a set of large public or communal structures whose purposes remain debated, but whose scale suggests they served the whole community rather than a single ruler. The most famous of these is the Great Bath, a large waterproofed tank measuring roughly 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and nearly 3 meters deep, lined with fired brick and sealed with a bitumen layer to prevent leakage, fed by a well, and drained through a corbelled drain into the city's wider drainage network. Around the bath stood smaller rooms and what appear to be changing areas or ancillary chambers. The most widely accepted interpretation is that the Great Bath served some form of ritual purification, a practice that connects, at least symbolically, to the importance of ritual bathing in later South Asian religious traditions. But no inscription, no image, and no written record confirms this. It remains an educated inference. Near the Great Bath stood a large building that early excavators called the granary, a massive structure with a series of loading bays and what appeared to be ventilation channels beneath the floor. The granary interpretation was once widely accepted, but more recent analysis has complicated the picture. The ventilation channels may not have served grain storage. The building may have had administrative or ceremonial functions. What matters is the scale. Whatever this building was, it was built to handle large quantities of something, whether grain, goods, or people, and it was built with the same careful, standardized construction that characterizes every major structure at Mohenjo-daro. That standardization is one of the civilization's most striking and most puzzling features. The fired bricks used at Mohenjo-daro, at Harappa, and at dozens of smaller Indus sites across a region stretching more than 1 million square kilometers conform to the same ratio of roughly 1 to 2 to 4, that is, height to width to length. This is not a coincidence. Achieving this consistency across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers in an era without digital communication or centralized manufacturing required either a very strong shared cultural convention or some form of coordinated authority that we have not yet identified. The same is true of the weights and measures used across the Indus world. Stone weights found at sites from the Arabian Sea coast to the foothills of the Himalayas conform to the same binary system, doubling in precise increments from the smallest unit to the largest. A merchant in Mohenjo-daro and a merchant in a small trading post far to the north were using the same measuring system. That kind of standardization does not happen by accident. The streets of the lower city reinforce this impression of deliberate large-scale planning. The main streets ran roughly north to south and east to west, creating a grid of city blocks. Within those blocks, lanes branched off to serve individual houses. The houses themselves were substantial structures built in fired brick, often 2 stories tall, oriented inward around central courtyards rather than outward toward the street. Street-facing walls were largely blank, with narrow doorways set into them. This inward orientation gave each household privacy and protection from street noise and dust. But it also meant that the public face of Mohenjo-daro was the street itself, the shared infrastructure, the drains, the wells, the lanes, not the display of individual wealth or power. The drainage system of Mohenjo-daro deserves special attention because it is, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated achievements of the ancient world. Almost every house had its own bathroom, a paved area with a drain that connected to a covered channel running along the street, which in turn connected to larger brick-lined drains that carried wastewater out of the city. Inspection holes were built into the drains at intervals so that workers could clear blockages. Chutes in the walls of houses allowed household garbage to be deposited directly into bins or collection points at street level. This was not primitive sanitation. This was a planned, maintained, citywide waste management system of a kind that would not be matched in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The Roman Empire, often celebrated for its engineering, built its famous sewers roughly 2,000 years after Mohenjo-daro's drains were already functioning. Who maintained all of this? Who organized the labor to keep the drains clear, to repair the streets, to enforce the building standards, to manage the wells? This is the central mystery of Mohenjo-daro, and it is the question that separates it from every other major ancient civilization we know. In Mesopotamia, the answer was the temple and the palace. The ziggurat complex at or Uruk was simultaneously a religious center, an administrative hub, a granary, and the seat of royal power. The king ruled in the name of the gods, and the gods' priests managed the economy. In Egypt, the pharaoh was himself divine, and the entire apparatus of the state, the scribes, the soldiers, the architects, the tax collectors, was his instrument. In early China, in the Shang dynasty, royal authority was expressed through oracle bones, ancestor worship, and military power concentrated in the hands of a ruling lineage. Mohenjo-daro shows none of these patterns clearly. There is no monumental temple. There is no royal palace. There are no royal tombs. There are no large-scale military installations, no weapon caches, no fortifications in the conventional sense. The raised citadel mound has a defensive perimeter, but whether this was primarily military or simply a way of elevating important civic structures above flood level is not settled. There are no victory steles, no commemorative inscriptions celebrating a king's conquest of enemies, no artistic depictions of rulers trampling the defeated in Mesopotamia and Egypt. This kind of royal propaganda was everywhere. In the Indus Valley, it is simply absent. This absence has led to several competing theories about how Mohenjo-daro was actually governed. Some researchers have proposed that the city was ruled by a priestly class rather than a secular king, a theocracy of sorts in which religious authority substituted for royal power. The Great Bath fits this interpretation, as does the apparent importance of ritual cleanliness in the material culture of the site. Others have suggested a kind of merchant oligarchy in which wealthy traders and craft specialists held collective authority over civic life. The extraordinary standardization of weights and measures would support this, since a trading class would have the strongest interest in enforcing uniform commercial standards. A third view held by some scholars is that Indus cities were genuinely more egalitarian than their Mesopotamian or Egyptian contemporaries. That authority was distributed local and community-based in ways that left fewer traces in the archaeological record. The honest answer is that we do not know. The Indus script, which appears on thousands of small seals and tablets found across the civilization, has never been deciphered. Until it is, or unless new discoveries change the picture. The governance of Mohenjo-daro will remain one of archaeology's most tantalizing open questions. What we can say with confidence is that the city functioned. It fed its population, it managed its waste, it traded across enormous distances. Goods from Mohenjo-daro have been found in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian objects have been found in the Indus region. The Indus people traded lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian beads from Gujarat, timber from the forests of the north, and cotton textiles that were almost certainly among the earliest in the world. Cotton was domesticated in the Indus Valley, and the people of Mohenjo-daro were weaving it into cloth at a time when the rest of the ancient world was still working primarily with wool and linen. A single carnelian bead found in a royal tomb at Ur, in Mesopotamia, dated to around 2500 before Common Era, is almost certainly of Indus origin. The connections were real, the trade was active, and the city was not isolated from the wider ancient world. The craft production of Mohenjo-daro was extraordinary in its range and quality. Potters produced wheel-thrown ceramics with a characteristic red slip and black painted decoration that is found consistently across the Indus world. Another marker of shared cultural standards. Bead makers worked in carnelian, lapis, lazuli, steatite, shell, and faience, producing jewelry of remarkable delicacy. Metalworkers cast copper and bronze tools and ornaments. Seal carvers created the small steatite seals that are among the most recognizable artifacts of the civilization, each bearing an animal image, most often a mysterious one-horned animal that scholars call the unicorn, though it was almost certainly a representation of a real animal shown in profile, along with a short inscription in the undeciphered script. These seals were probably used to mark ownership or authenticate goods in trade, functioning something like a signature or a stamp of origin. The human population of Mohenjo-daro left behind traces of their daily lives that are, in some ways, surprisingly intimate. Children's toys have been found, including small wheeled carts, animal figurines, and what appear to be rattles. Dice have been found, suggesting games of chance. Elaborate jewelry, including necklaces, bangles, and earrings in gold, silver, and semi-precious stones, speaks to a concern with personal adornment. Small terracotta figurines, many of them female, appear throughout the city, though their religious or ritual significance is uncertain. A famous bronze statuette known as the Dancing Girl, a young woman in a confident pose with one hand on her hip, wearing bangles on her arm, captures something of the human vitality of the place in a way that no amount of brick measurement can. The city's relationship with the Indus River was fundamental and complicated. The river gave the city its agricultural base, its water supply, and its connection to trade routes. But the Indus is not a gentle river. It is one of the most powerful and unpredictable river systems in Asia. prone to catastrophic floods that can shift the river's course by many kilometers in a single season. The evidence at Mohenjo-daro shows that the city was flooded multiple times during its occupation. Each time, rather than abandoning the site, the inhabitants rebuilt. They raised the level of the city by constructing new platforms of mud brick over the flood deposits, and they built again on top. This is why the site today shows multiple layers of occupation stacked on top of one another, with the earliest levels buried deep below the current surface, inaccessible to excavation without draining the water table that now floods them. The city literally rose from its own ruins, rebuilding itself higher and higher above the floodplain over centuries of occupation. This pattern of rebuilding after floods tells us something important about the people of Mohenjo-daro. They were not passive victims of their environment. They understood the flood cycle well enough to plan for it. The raised citadel platform, the elevated streets, the carefully constructed drainage system, all of these were adaptations to a landscape that gave generously, but also took back without warning. The city's planners, whoever they were, thought in terms of long timescales. They built infrastructure meant to last, and they built it with enough redundancy and adaptability to survive repeated disasters. By around 2500, before Common Era, Mohenjo-daro had reached its peak. The population may have been somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people, though estimates vary and the true figure is impossible to confirm. The city covered an area of roughly 250 hectares, making it one of the largest urban centers in the ancient world at that time. Its streets were busy with traders, craft workers, farmers bringing produce from the surrounding countryside, and probably travelers and merchants from distant places. The seals and weights and standardized bricks connected it to a network of cities and towns stretching across the Indus Plain, making the whole system something greater than the sum of its parts. This was the mature Harappan phase, the period of maximum urban complexity, and it lasted for roughly 6 or 7 centuries. 6 or 7 centuries of a functioning, sophisticated, largely peaceful urban civilization. To put that in perspective, that is longer than the entire history of the United States from its founding to today. It is longer than the period from the Black Death in Europe to the present. It is a very long time for any human institution to hold together, let alone one operating without the coercive apparatus of kingship and standing armies that most ancient civilizations relied upon. But the pressures were building. They always do. The first signs of stress appear in the archaeological records sometime around 2100 to 1900, before Common Era, though the exact timing and sequence are subjects of ongoing research and debate. The nature of those stresses is itself disputed, and the honest answer is that no single cause has been proven. What the evidence suggests is a convergence of multiple pressures, each one manageable on its own, but together forming a weight that the civilization's remarkable organizational capacity could not bear indefinitely. Climate change is one of the most discussed factors. Paleoclimate research, meaning the study of ancient climate patterns through evidence preserved in lake sediments, pollen records, cave formations, and other natural archives, has suggested that the Indian subcontinent experienced a significant weakening of the monsoon system sometime in the second millennium before Common Era. The monsoon is not just rain, it is the engine of South Asian agriculture. A weakening monsoon means reduced rainfall, lower river levels, shorter growing seasons, and reduced crop yields. For a civilization whose population had grown to depend on intensive agriculture across a large area, a sustained reduction in monsoon rainfall would have been deeply destabilizing. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which ran through the eastern part of the Indus world and supported a dense concentration of settlements, appears to have been drying out during this period, possibly because of reduced Himalayan snowmelt and reduced monsoon rainfall feeding its upper tributaries. River dynamics also played a role. The Indus and its tributaries are not fixed features of the landscape. They shift their courses over time, sometimes dramatically and quickly. There is evidence that major river avulsions, sudden changes in river course, disrupted the agricultural hinterlands of some Indus cities during the late Harappan period. A city built on the assumption that the river will always be where it is today faces an existential crisis if the river moves. The agricultural land that fed the city, the water supply that sustained it, the trade routes that connected it, all of these could be disrupted by a shift in the river's path. Alongside climate and hydrology, there were signs of internal stress. The later levels of Mohenjo-daro show a decline in the quality and standardization of construction. Houses that were once built to careful standards began to show more improvised, less regular construction. Streets that were once kept clear began to be encroached upon by buildings. The drainage system, which had been maintained with evident care for centuries, shows signs of neglect and partial blockage. Craft production continued but showed less of the remarkable uniformity that had characterized the mature phase. These are the material signatures of a society under stress, one in which the social mechanisms that had enforced standards and maintained infrastructure were weakening. There is also evidence, though it requires careful interpretation, of population movement. The number of large urban centers in the Indus world appears to decline in the late period, while the number of smaller rural sites increases, particularly in the eastern part of the civilization's territory, in what is now the Indian states of Gujarat, Haryana, and Rajasthan. This pattern suggests that people were moving away from the large cities, perhaps seeking more reliable agricultural land, perhaps following the shifting rivers, perhaps responding to the breakdown of the urban trade networks that had made city life viable. Urbanization in reverse, the dispersal of a city population back into the countryside, is not a dramatic event. It leaves no ruins, no burned buildings, no dramatic skeletal evidence of massacre. It is a slow, quiet process that takes generations, and it is exactly the kind of process that is hardest to see in the archaeological record. The question of whether there was violence at the end of Mohenjo-daro has been debated since the earliest days of excavation. The British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, who directed major excavations at the site in the 1940s, famously interpreted a group of skeletons found in the upper levels of the site as evidence of a massacre, and he connected this to the arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples from the northwest, the same peoples whose descendants would compose the Vedas. Wheeler's interpretation was vivid and influential, but it has been substantially revised by later scholarship. The skeletal evidence, when re-examined, does not clearly support a single massacre event. The bodies were found in different contexts and different stratigraphic layers, suggesting they died at different times and from different causes, possibly including disease, flood, or simple abandonment of proper burial practices during a period of social disruption. The evidence for a violent conquest of Mohenjo-daro is, in the current scholarly consensus, not strong. This matters because it changes how we understand the end of the city. A city destroyed by conquest has a different story than a city gradually abandoned. Mohenjo-daro appears to have been gradually abandoned. The process was not a single catastrophe but a long, slow unraveling spread over perhaps 2 or 3 centuries in which the population declined, the urban infrastructure ceased to be maintained, the trade networks contracted, and eventually the site was simply no longer home to a functioning city. The last inhabitants of Mohenjo-daro were not slaughtered. They left. Where they went and what became of them is one of the great unresolved questions of South Asian prehistory. The broader Indus Valley civilization did not vanish with the cities. What archaeologists call the late Harappan phase shows a transformation rather than a simple collapse. The large cities declined, but the cultural traditions of the Indus world persisted in modified forms across a wider geographic area. Craft techniques, pottery styles, and some aspects of the distinctive Indus material culture survived in regional variants for centuries after the great cities had been abandoned. Some researchers have argued that elements of Indus culture were absorbed into the later cultures of South Asia, contributing to the religious, agricultural, and craft traditions that would eventually feed into the civilization of the Gangetic Plain and the broader South Asian cultural world. This is a contested area, and the evidence is indirect, but the idea that the Indus Valley civilization simply disappeared without a trace is almost certainly wrong. The site of Mohenjo-daro itself lay buried and forgotten for roughly 3,500 years. The mounds that marked the buried city were visible on the landscape, and local tradition preserved the name, which in the Sindhi language means something close to Mound of the Dead, though whether this name reflects ancient memory of the city or is simply a description of the mounds themselves is not clear. The surrounding region continued to be inhabited through the Vedic period, through the Achaemenid Persian occupation of Sind in the late 6th century before Common Era, through the campaigns of Alexander of Macedon in the 4th century before Common Era, through the Mauryan Empire, the Kushan Empire, the Gupta period, the Arab conquest of Sind in the 8th century of the Common Era, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire, and finally into the British colonial period. Through all of that history, the buried city slept beneath its mounds, unknown to the scholars and rulers who passed nearby. The rediscovery began quietly. In 1856 Common Era, British engineers supervising the construction of the East Indian Railway between Karachi and Lahore found themselves short of ballast material for the railway bed. A local engineer named William Brunton was told that there was a source of hard fire-baked bricks in the area of a ruined city called Brahminabad. Brunton sent workers to collect bricks, and they found what they needed, not at Brahminabad, but at another site nearby, which turned out to be Harappa. The workers dug up and crushed thousands of ancient fired bricks to lay under the railway tracks. It is estimated that roughly 100 miles of the Lahore to Multan Railway was built on a foundation of bricks from Harappa, one of the great acts of inadvertent archaeological destruction in history. A few curious observers noted the unusual quality and uniformity of the bricks, and one, The amateur archaeologist Alexander Cunningham collected some artifacts from the site, including a seal with an undeciphered inscription. But the significance of what had been found was not understood. Systematic archaeological investigation of the Indus region did not begin until the early 20th century. In 1912 Common Era, a British archaeologist named John Marshall became Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, and under his direction more careful attention was paid to the ancient sites of the Northwest. In 1921, Common Era Daya Ram Sani began excavations at Harappa and found clear evidence of a major ancient urban center. The following year, in 1922, Common Era R.D. Banerjee, an Indian archaeologist working for the Archaeological Survey, began excavations at the mounds near the village of Mohenjo-daro in Sindh. What he found stopped the scholarly world in its tracks. Banerjee found fired bricks, streets, drains, and artifacts of a kind and quality that clearly indicated a major ancient city. More importantly, the style of the artifacts, and particularly the seals with their undeciphered inscriptions, matched what Sani was finding at Harappa, hundreds of kilometers away. The two sites were connected. They were part of the same civilization, a civilization that no one in the modern world had known existed. John Marshall, who coordinated the early investigations, announced the discovery to the world in 1924 Common Era in the Illustrated London News, and the response was immediate and electric. The ancient world had just grown much larger. Marshall's announcement was not merely an academic event. It was a challenge to received ideas about the origins of civilization in South Asia. The dominant narrative at the time held that Indian civilization had begun with the arrival of the Vedic peoples, the Indo-Aryan speakers whose hymns formed the Rig Veda, somewhere around 1500, before Common Era or perhaps earlier. The Indus Valley civilization predated the Rig Veda by at least 1,000 years, possibly more. It was not a primitive precursor to Vedic culture. It was a fully developed urban civilization in its own right, with its own script, its own art, its own urban planning, its own trade networks, and its own social organization, all of it flourishing and then declining, before the Vedic period even began. This had immediate implications for the politics of the time. India in the 1920s was in the midst of its independence movement, and questions of historical identity were charged with political meaning. The discovery of the Indus Valley civilization gave the subcontinent a documented urban history stretching back to at least 2600 before Common Era, predating the Greek and Roman civilizations that British colonial education had placed at the center of world history. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro were not just archaeological evidence. They were a statement about the depth and sophistication of South Asian civilization that carried weight far beyond the academic world. Excavations at Mohenjo-daro continued through the 1920s and 1930s under Marshall and then under Ernest Mackay, who produced detailed reports on the site. Mortimer Wheeler's excavations in the 1940s brought more rigorous stratigraphic methods to the site and produced the influential, if later revised, interpretations about the city's end. After Indian independence and the partition of 1947 Common Era, Mohenjo-daro fell within the territory of the newly created Pakistan, and Pakistani archaeologists took over the work. Ahmad Hassan Dani and other Pakistani scholars continued investigations through the following decades, and the site was declared a World Heritage Site by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization in 1980 Common Era. But excavation at Mohenjo-daro has always been constrained by a fundamental problem. The water table beneath the site has risen significantly since ancient times, due to irrigation works in the surrounding region, and the lower levels of the city, which contain the earliest phases of occupation and potentially the most important evidence about the city's origins and governance, are permanently waterlogged. Excavating them would require draining a large area of the water table, a technically and financially demanding project that has not yet been undertaken. What we know about Mohenjo-daro is based primarily on the upper, later levels of the site. The deeper story, the story of how the city began and how it developed its remarkable urban form, is still largely locked underground. The preservation of what has been excavated is itself a serious concern. Fired bricks of Mohenjo-daro, which survived underground for thousands of years protected by the soil, have been exposed to wind, rain, and rising salt from the water table since excavation. Salt crystallization is a particularly destructive process. As water drawn up through the brick by capillary action evaporates, it leaves behind salt crystals that expand and contract with temperature changes, gradually breaking the brick apart from within. Sections of the site that were excavated in the 1920s and 30s are visibly deteriorating. Efforts at conservation have been made, but the resources available have never been sufficient to fully address the problem. One of the greatest cities of the ancient world is, in a very real sense, dissolving. The undeciphered script remains the most tantalizing obstacle to understanding Mohenjo-daro and the Indus Valley civilization more broadly. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 distinct inscriptions have been found on seals, pottery, tablets, and other objects from across the Indus world. The script contains somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs, which suggests it is either a logographic system where each sign represents a word or concept, or a mixed system combining logographic and phonetic elements. It is clearly not a simple alphabet. The inscriptions are short, typically between 4 and 7 signs, which makes statistical analysis difficult and has so far defeated every attempt at decipherment. The language underlying the script is unknown. Some researchers have proposed that it represents an early form of a Dravidian language related to the family that includes modern Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, which are spoken primarily in southern India today. This would suggest that the Indus Valley people were ancestors of the Dravidian-speaking populations of South Asia, who were later pushed southward by the expansion of Indo-Aryan speakers. Other researchers have proposed that the language was related to an early form of Sanskrit or to a now extinct language family with no modern descendants. The debate is genuinely unresolved, and without a bilingual inscription, something like the Rosetta Stone that allowed the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, a definitive solution may be very difficult to achieve. What the script's existence tells us, regardless of what it says, is that the Indus Valley civilization had developed writing as a tool for recording information. The seals on which most inscriptions appear were almost certainly used in trade, as markers of ownership or authentication. This fits with everything else we know about the civilization's extraordinary commercial organization. The script was a practical tool, probably primarily economic in its applications, though it may also have had ritual or religious uses that we cannot currently access. The iconography of the seals, the images that accompany the inscriptions, has been more accessible to interpretation, though not without controversy. The most common image is the so-called unicorn, an animal with a single horn shown in profile, standing before a device that may be a ritual offering stand or incense burner. The unicorn is found on more seals than any other image, suggesting it had particular symbolic or commercial importance. Other animals depicted include the zebu bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, the water buffalo, and various composite creatures that appear to have mythological significance. A particularly famous seal, known as the Pashupati seal, found at Mohenjo-daro, shows a seated figure in what appears to be a yogic posture, surrounded by animals. Some scholars have interpreted this as an early depiction of the Hindu god Shiva in his aspect as lord of animals, suggesting a continuity of religious imagery from the Indus world to later Hinduism. Others are more cautious, pointing out that the identification is not certain and that reading later religious categories back onto earlier iconography is methodologically risky. The question of continuity between the Indus Valley civilization and later South Asian cultures is one of the most important and most contested in the field. On one side are those who see strong continuities, arguing that elements of Indus religious practice, urban organization, craft tradition, and possibly language survived the collapse of the cities and fed into the later cultures of the subcontinent. On the other side are those who emphasize the discontinuities, pointing to the apparent break in urban life, the disappearance of the script, the end of the standardized weight and measure system, and the shift to a different kind of social organization in the post-Harappan period. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions, as it usually is in history. Some things were lost, some things persisted. The task of separating them, without a deciphered script and with an incomplete archaeological record, is enormously difficult. What is not contested is the significance of what Mohenjo-daro achieved. Consider the Great Bath again. Here was a city that, more than 4,500 years ago, built a public facility for ritual cleansing that was waterproofed, drained, and maintained as a communal resource. The concept of public infrastructure, of shared civic space maintained for the benefit of all, is one that modern cities take for granted. In the ancient world, it was rare. Most ancient urban infrastructure served the elite: the temple, the palace, the army. Mohenjo-daro's drains served every household. Mohenjo-daro's wells were distributed throughout the city, not concentrated in elite areas. Mohenjo-daro's streets were wide enough for carts and maintained well enough for commerce. This was a city built for its inhabitants, not for the glorification of a ruler. That observation connects to what may be the deepest question about Mohenjo-daro, not why it fell, but how it lasted so long. Every ancient civilization we know of eventually developed coercive authority, a class of people with the power to compel others to work, to pay, to obey, to fight. The evidence from Mohenjo-daro suggests that coercive authority, if it existed at all, was less visible, less monumental, and less central to the city's functioning than in any comparable ancient civilization. The city ran on something else. Perhaps it ran on shared norms, on the kind of deeply embedded cultural consensus about how things should be done that makes formal enforcement unnecessary. Perhaps it ran on the self-interest of a trading class that understood that standardization and honest dealing were more profitable than extraction and coercion. Perhaps it ran on a religious or ritual framework that we cannot currently see because we cannot read the script. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a city that functioned for centuries without leaving the kind of propaganda and power display that makes ancient rulers so visible in the historical record. The invisibility of power at Mohenjo-daro is not evidence of the absence of organization. It may be evidence of a different kind of organization, one that worked through consensus and shared practice rather than through command and coercion. If that interpretation is even partially correct, it is one of the most remarkable things about the city. The legacy of Mohenjo-daro reaches forward in time, in ways that are hard to trace precisely but impossible to ignore entirely. The practice of ritual bathing, which the Great Bath may represent, is central to Hindu religious life today. The zebu cattle depicted on Indus seals are the same cattle that remain sacred in Hindu tradition. The practice of yoga, with its emphasis on controlled posture and breath, has been tentatively connected to the seated figure on the Pashupati seal, though this connection remains speculative. The importance of personal cleanliness, reflected in the extraordinary sanitation infrastructure of Mohenjo-daro, is a value deeply embedded in South Asian culture. Whether these connections represent direct cultural continuity or independent convergence is a question that may never be fully resolved. But the resonances are real. In modern Pakistan, Mohenjo-daro occupies a complicated place in national identity. Pakistan as a nation came into existence in 1947, common era, carved out of the British Indian Empire as a homeland for the Muslim population of the subcontinent. The Indus Valley civilization predates Islam by more than 3,000 years, and its religious and cultural character, to the extent that it can be reconstructed, has more obvious connections to Hindu and Dravidian traditions than to Islamic ones. For some Pakistani intellectuals and politicians, Mohenjo-daro represents a pre-Islamic heritage that complicates straightforward narratives of national identity. For others, it represents the deep roots of civilization on the territory of Pakistan, a source of national pride that transcends religious boundaries. The site appears on Pakistani currency and is used as a symbol of the country's ancient heritage in official contexts. In India, the Indus Valley civilization has been claimed as part of the deep roots of Indian civilization, with the question of whether Indus culture was continuous with or distinct from Vedic culture carrying significant political and religious weight in the context of Hindu nationalist politics. The debate about whether the Indus Valley people spoke a Dravidian language or an early form of Sanskrit, whether they were the ancestors of the Dravidian South or the Aryan North, or both or neither, has become entangled with contemporary identity politics in ways that sometimes make it difficult to have a purely scholarly conversation about the evidence. This is, in some ways, the final irony of Mohenjo-daro. A city that appears to have organized itself without the kind of coercive, identity-defining authority that leaves propaganda in the archaeological record has become, in its rediscovered state, a site of competing national and ethnic claims. The city that left no royal inscriptions, no victory steels, no monuments to a single ruler's glory, has been recruited into the service of modern nationalisms that are, in their essence, exactly the kind of power-asserting, identity-defining projects that the Indus Valley civilization seems to have avoided. The archaeological work continues slowly and under difficult conditions. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey technologies have been used to map buried structures without excavation, revealing details of the city's layout that were not visible to earlier excavators. Satellite imagery has helped identify the extent of ancient settlement in the surrounding region. Genetic studies of ancient human remains from Indus Valley sites have begun to shed light on the population history of the region, though the results are complex and the interpretation is still evolving. A study published in 2019 Common Era, based on ancient DNA from a burial site at Rocky Gori in India, suggested that the Indus Valley people were genetically distinct from both the steppe populations associated with Indo-Aryan migration and the populations of ancient Iran, and that they contributed significantly to the ancestry of later South Asian populations. This supports the idea of cultural and biological continuity between the Indus world and later South Asia, even as the urban civilization itself collapsed. The conservation crisis at Mohenjo-daro has attracted international attention. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization has been involved in conservation efforts, and various national and international organizations have contributed funding and expertise. But the fundamental problem, the rising water table and the salt damage it causes, has not been solved. Every year, more of the ancient city is lost. The bricks that survived 4.5 millennia underground are not surviving the century since their excavation. This is a loss not just for Pakistan or for South Asia, but for the entire human story, because Mohenjo-daro is evidence of something that the rest of ancient history does not easily provide, proof that large-scale urban civilization can be organized differently, that the coercive apparatus of kingship and military power is not the only path to complexity. There is a detail from the excavations at Mohenjo-daro that has stayed with researchers for decades, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quietly extraordinary. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from the site, there are almost no weapons. There are a few spearheads and arrowheads, but nothing like the arsenals found at comparable ancient sites in Mesopotamia or Egypt. There are no depictions of warfare in the art of the Indus Valley civilization, no battle scenes, no defeated enemies, no triumphant warriors. This is not because the Indus people had no contact with the outside world. They traded across enormous distances and presumably encountered peoples with different customs and different levels of aggression. Yet the material culture of Mohenjo-daro does not celebrate violence. It celebrates craft, trade, cleanliness, and civic order. Whether this reflects a genuinely more peaceful society, or simply a different set of cultural values about what was worth depicting, or whether violence was present but simply not commemorated in the ways that have left traces in the record, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the absence of martial imagery in a civilization that lasted for centuries across a vast territory is, at minimum, a remarkable fact that deserves to be taken seriously rather than explained away. Mohenjo-daro also challenges us to think about what we mean by collapse. The word carries connotations of sudden catastrophe, of a civilization destroyed by some overwhelming force from outside or inside. But the end of Mohenjo-daro was not that kind of event. It was a long, slow transformation, spread over perhaps 2 or 3 centuries, in which the urban system that had sustained the city gradually became unsustainable. The climate shifted, the rivers moved, the agricultural surplus that fed the city shrank. The trade networks that had connected the city to distant sources of raw materials contracted. The social mechanisms that had maintained urban standards and enforced civic norms weakened. People left, not all at once, but steadily over generations, finding their livelihoods more reliably in smaller communities closer to reliable water sources. This kind of collapse, the gradual dissolution of a complex system under accumulated pressure, is arguably more common in history than the dramatic conquests and catastrophes that tend to dominate popular historical memory. It is also arguably more relevant to the present. The cities and systems of the modern world face their own versions of the pressures that undid Mohenjo-daro: climate change, shifting water resources, the strains on civic infrastructure and social norms that come with rapid change. The Indus Valley civilization did not fail because its people were primitive or because they lacked intelligence or ingenuity. It failed because it encountered a combination of pressures that exceeded the adaptive capacity of its institutions. That is a lesson with no expiration date. The story of Mohenjo-daro is, in the end, a story about the possibilities and limits of human organization. It is the story of a people who built something extraordinary, without the tools that most of history has considered necessary for building extraordinary things. They built without kings, without monumental temples to named gods, without standing armies, without a script we can read, without leaving the kind of record that makes ancient rulers so visible to us across the millennia. They built a city that was cleaner, better drained, and more equitably organized than most cities that came after it for thousands of years. They sustained it through floods and droughts and the slow shifting of rivers for longer than many empires have lasted, and then quietly they let it go. What they left behind is not a monument to a ruler's glory. It is something rarer and in its way more moving. It is evidence that human beings, given the right circumstances and the right cultural inheritance, can organize themselves at scale without the machinery of domination. Not perfectly, not forever, but for long enough to matter. The drains of Mohenjo-daro are not as famous as the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. They are not as visually spectacular, but they represent something the pyramids and ziggurats do not: a city that served its people rather than demanding that its people serve the city's rulers. That is the legacy of Mohenjo-daro, and it is worth knowing. If this story made you think differently about the ancient world, please leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Was it the sophistication of the drainage system, the absence of kings, the standardized weights connecting a civilization larger than ancient Egypt? Your comments help us understand what resonates and help new viewers find this work. Please subscribe to our channel if you have not already, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told, stories of civilizations that have been overlooked, misunderstood, or buried under the weight of more famous histories. And if you want to continue exploring the ancient world, visit our channel and open the history playlist. There is always more to discover. The people who built Mohenjo-daro did not think of themselves as building for posterity. No ancient civilization does. They built for the practical demands of daily life, for shelter, for commerce, for the management of water, for the performance of whatever rituals gave their world meaning. The fact that their work has outlasted them by more than 4,000 years, even in its damaged and partially dissolved state, is a consequence of how well they built, not of any intention to be remembered, and yet the city does remember itself in the only language available to the mute archaeological record, through form. The form of the streets tells us about the values of the people who laid them out. The form of the houses tells us about the relationship between private life and public space. The form of the drains tells us about a society that considered the management of waste a collective responsibility rather than an individual problem. The form of the Great Bath tells us about a community that set aside a significant portion of its most valuable real estate, the elevated citadel mound, for a structure that served ritual and communal purposes rather than the display of individual power. These formal choices were not accidents. They were decisions made by people with knowledge, judgment, and presumably debate about how a city should be organized. We cannot hear those debates. We cannot read the records, if any were kept in perishable materials that have not survived. We cannot access the names or the arguments of the people who decided that the drains should be covered, that the streets should be wide enough for 2 carts to pass, that the bricks should conform to a standard ratio. But the decisions themselves are visible in the ruins, and they speak to a level of civic intentionality that is genuinely remarkable. One of the more thought-provoking aspects of Mohenjo-daro's archaeology is what it suggests about literacy and knowledge management. The Indus script, whatever language it encoded, was clearly used across a wide geographic area in a consistent form. This means that the script was taught, that there were people who knew how to write it and how to read it, and that this knowledge was transmitted across generations and across the distances that separated Mohenjo-daro from Harappa and from the dozens of smaller sites where inscribed seals and tablets have been found. Literacy, even a specialized and limited literacy confined to particular uses like trade authentication, requires institutions of transmission, teachers, students, some form of practice and correction. The Indus world had these institutions, even if we cannot see them directly. The seals themselves, more than 4,000 of them recovered across the civilization's territory, are among the most intimate objects the Indus world has left behind. Each one was carved by hand from stadeite, a soft stone that hardens when heated, using tools of copper or bronze. The carving required skill and patience. The images on the seals, the animals rendered with a naturalism and confidence that still impresses modern observers, were the work of craftspeople who had mastered their medium over years of practice. The unicorn, the zebu bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, each animal is depicted with an attention to posture and proportion that suggests the carvers knew these animals well, observed them carefully, and had developed a visual vocabulary for representing them that was shared across the entire civilization. This shared visual vocabulary is itself a form of language, one that we can partially read even without deciphering the script. The unicorn, whatever it represented, was important enough to be depicted more than any other image across the entire civilization. It appears at sites from the Arabian Sea to the Himalayan foothills, always in the same posture, always before the same device that may be an offering stand or a ritual object. This consistency across such a vast area and such a long period of time, perhaps 500 years or more, tells us that the symbol carried a meaning that was understood and valued across the entire Indus world. We do not know what that meaning was, but its persistence and its geographic reach speak to a cultural unity that is all the more striking for being achieved without, as far as we can tell, a centralized political authority enforcing it. The agricultural base that supported Mohenjo-daro also deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts focused on the city's urban achievements. The city did not feed itself. It was fed by a surrounding agricultural hinterland of considerable extent, worked by farmers whose lives and practices we know less about than we know about the urban craftspeople and traders. The crops grown in the Indus world included wheat, barley, peas, sesame, and cotton. There is also evidence of rice cultivation in some parts of the Indus world, particularly in the eastern and southern regions, though whether rice was a major crop at Mohenjo-daro itself is less clear. The domestication of cotton in the Indus Valley is one of the civilization's most consequential contributions to human history. Cotton would eventually become one of the most important crops in the world, and its cultivation and weaving began here, in the communities of the Indus Plain, more than 4,000 years ago. The farmers who grew these crops were not simply passive suppliers to the urban economy. They were participants in a system of exchange that connected them to the city's craft production, its trade networks, and presumably its ritual and social life. The relationship between city and countryside in the Indus world is not well understood, partly because rural sites have received less excavation attention than the major urban centers. But the density of settlement across the Indus Plain, with hundreds of small sites clustered around the major cities, suggests a complex and active relationship between urban and rural life that was central to the civilization's functioning. Water management, beyond the famous drains of Mohenjo-daro itself, was a civilization-wide concern. The Indus world shows evidence of sophisticated water management at multiple scales, from the household drains and public wells of the city to what appeared to be larger-scale water storage and management features at some sites. At Dholavira, a major Indus city in the Rann of Kutch, in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, excavation teams found an elaborate system of reservoirs and channels designed to capture and store the limited rainfall of a semi-arid environment. Dholavira's water management system is arguably the most sophisticated known from the ancient world for its time and place. It speaks to a civilization that thought carefully and systematically about water at every scale, from the individual household drain to the city-wide reservoir, and that invested significant collective resources in solving the problem of water security. This systematic approach to practical problems is perhaps the most consistent thread running through everything we know about the Indus Valley civilization. Whether the problem was waste management, water supply, trade authentication, building construction, or the measurement of goods in the marketplace, the Indus response was to develop a standardized, replicable, widely shared solution and then apply it consistently across an enormous area. This is not the behavior of a disorganized or primitive society. It is the behavior of a society with strong institutions, effective communication, and a cultural commitment to solving problems collectively rather than leaving them to individual improvisation. That cultural commitment, whatever its ultimate source in religion, in commercial self-interest, in deeply embedded social norms, or in some combination of all three, is what made Mohenjo-daro possible, and it is what makes Mohenjo-daro worth thinking about carefully, not just as a curiosity of the ancient world, but as evidence of a different way of organizing human collective life. Civilizations are usually remembered by their monuments to power, the pyramids, the colosseums, the triumphal arches, the palace complexes that announce in stone and gold that someone here commanded and others obeyed. Mohenjo-daro's monuments are drains and wells and standardized bricks. They are less photogenic, they are harder to explain to a casual visitor. But they represent something that the pyramids, for all their grandeur, do not, a city that invested its collective resources in the infrastructure of daily life rather than in the glorification of those who ruled it. Whether that represents a moral achievement, a practical adaptation, or simply a different cultural logic that we should not too quickly evaluate in modern terms, is a question worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. History is full of civilizations that achieved great things through coercion and full of others that achieved different things through consensus. Mohenjo-daro stands uniquely and somewhat mysteriously in the second category, a city that worked for a long time by different rules. The mounds of Mohenjo-daro still rise above the Sindh plain, visible for miles in the flat landscape. The wind moves across them, carrying dust from the dissolving bricks. The water table continues its slow work of destruction below. Somewhere beneath the waterlogged lower levels, the earliest chapters of the city's story remain unread. And across the excavated upper city, the outlines of streets and houses and drains and the Great Bath speak quietly and without drama of a people who built something worth remembering, even if they never asked to be remembered. That is perhaps the most human thing about them. If this documentary on Mohenjo-daro changed how you think about the ancient world, we would genuinely love to hear from you. Leave a comment below with the detail that surprised you most, or tell us which ancient civilization you would like us to cover next. Your engagement helps this channel reach more curious viewers around the world, and every subscription and every like genuinely makes a difference in helping us continue producing serious, carefully researched history. Subscribe to our channel, and then head over to our history playlist to keep exploring. The ancient world has many more stories waiting, and we are not done telling them.